So when you're looking at Ramp, it can be accessed via this navigation bar on the left, and it's going to be all the way at the top. So you'll actually see this button by default for the first 60 days post approval. So if you're past that 60-day window, you can actually include the snippet that I'll drop into the chat at the end of your URL. What that'll do is it'll provide you a little backdoor hack so that you can still get here even if you're past that 60-day window. So when we're looking at this, we can see the various steps that we need to take in order to be set up on Ramp. So first, if we wanted to see, okay, what does reviewing approval workflows entail? We can click into this Learn More button and it opens a window on the right-hand side. So this window is going to contain a short video up at the top. What's nice about these videos is it walks you through not only how to do it, but also why you should be doing it, and some best practices along the way. When you're ready to get there in the product, you can do so by clicking Get Started, or you can click the task name. So you'll notice that as you complete tasks in Ramp, those will become crossed out, and you can always see your progress reflected via this counter up above. You will not be doctor penalized if you're not at 100%. The reason why I like to have I like to recommend customers get as close to 100% as possible, if not 100%, is because that ensures that you're maximizing your time and money savings within Ramp. So I know that's top of mind for most customers, or most companies, I should say, going into the new year. And so wanted to make sure that we started today's session with just walking through not only what this is, but how to interact with it. So now let's go back to the left-hand navigation bar, and we're going to go down to the Accounting tab. So first, you'll notice that you can click Get Started, or you can select another team member to help set this up. Given we're on the accounting call today, we'll go ahead and click Get Started. You'll notice that it opens a window on the right. And so this is the part that might look a little bit different on your screen than it looks on mine. So like I mentioned, it looks like the majority of folks are using QuickBooks Online, so I will plan on showing that today. If you are using Xero, Sage, NetSuite, or if you're using another provider that's not listed, you can get that set up following the instructions that I sent in the chat. So we'll go ahead, we'll make sure that everyone has ample time to get that set up, but again, use the resources in the chat if you're not using QuickBooks Online. So I'll press Connect to QuickBooks Online, and then you'll notice that I now press Connect to QuickBooks. This is actually going to redirect me into QuickBooks. So first, I'll sign in. Once I sign in, we should be seeing a window that prompts us to connect Ramp to this specific account. So keep an eye on this account name. We will see that pulled into Ramp shortly. So now I'll press Connect. You'll notice that I'm redirected back into Ramp. So it really did only take, a minute or two and a couple of clicks. So it's really, a pretty quick setup, but I'll go ahead and take a quick pause here. So once you've connected accounting or uploaded your CSV, and you're seeing a screen that looks like this, feel free to give me a thumbs up emoji. That'll be a good indication for me that we're ready to move forward. Awesome. I'm seeing some thumbs up come through. Cool. Again, if you have any questions or issues while doing this, feel free to drop those into the chat. My goal for today's session is, I want everyone to walk out not only with a clear understanding of what the accounting page is, how to think about it, how to code transactions, but also, I want to make sure that everyone's in a good place from a setup perspective. Okay, seeing a lot of thumbs up, so we'll go ahead and move forward. So now let's click into settings. Before we do anything, let's just get our settings in order and set up properly. So you'll notice that the organization name was pulled over from QuickBooks, and we're seeing that reflected here. Below that, let's click into default accounts. So first, we'll select our primary statement payment account. You'll notice that it's pulling from the accounts that I've already verified. So now I can select the account. Below that, we'll select our credit card liability account. So this is the account that's used to track Ramp card expense liabilities. There's actually a default setting here called Ramp Card, and I recommend leaving this as the account. For some ERPs, I know NetSuite comes to mind. If you were to change this, it can result in duplicates in your ERP, which that is just a mess. I don't think any of us want to clean up unless we have to. So that's why I would recommend keeping the name of this as the default of Ramp Card. Below that, we'll select the cash back account. Next, we can select reimbursement accounts. And if you'd like to select a bill pay accounts or an accounts payable accounts for bills, you can do so here. So now we'll press Save Changes. And next we'll go back into Settings. Now we'll click into Manage Accounting Fields. So first, you'll see that your chart of accounts was pulled in. And if you attended yesterday's platform overview or even last week's, you may have remembered that during setting up submission policies for both card transaction and reimbursements, you can actually have your cardholders code the category. So if you've enabled this, you'll want to click the two arrows pointing away from one another. You can add helper text, or you can even select a default. This is good and helpful because it actually, gives cardholders a little bit better understanding of what this is and why they're doing it, especially if they haven't done this before. To the right of that, you can click Filter and Rename. You'll notice that all of the fields are pulled in. So if you'd like to hide any, it's really easy. You can just click the toggle. You can click these buttons up at the top to either make all visible or make all hidden. And then you'll be able to see which fields are visible and hidden via the tabs at the top. You can set this on a department level, so you'll notice that you can click into the drop-down and select the department. So now you'll notice that you can do this for all of the fields that you're pulling in. So you can do the same for vendor, location, class, customer job, and billable. And again, if you actually want to modify your expense policy so that your teammates have to submit information for any of these fields, we actually have a quick link little button here. So you can click this hyperlink and it'll take you there within Ramp. So we'll skip accounting automation for now because we'll cover that in great detail shortly. But the last thing I want to call out here is going to be the danger zone. So you'll see the danger zone a few different times within Ramp's product. That's generally a good indication that yes, you can take this action, you can proceed here, but you might want to proceed with caution. So in this case, in the danger zone, we can disconnect QuickBooks. If you were to disconnect the ERP that you just connected, this wouldn't prevent any data, or it wouldn't mess up anything that's already been synced over. On the Ramp side of things, your settings would be preserved. But if you had an active sync in progress, that would prevent any additional data from syncing. So anytime you see the danger zone within Ramp, feel free to reach out to the Ramp team and we'll be happy to help guide you along the way to ensure that everything is good to go when taking that action. So now when we're looking at the accounting page, we can see how many transactions we have to code and then sync over. And then scrolling down, you'll notice that the transactions are grouped by the date in which they occur. So this is going to provide a holistic view of all of your unsynced transactions. So when I frame the accounting page to customers, I like to think of it as a month end or, almost like a to-do list or a checklist. The reason being that as you code transactions and sync them from Ramp into your team's ERP, those transactions will actually disappear from this page. So at month end or month close, your goal is to have this page be blank. That means that all transactions have been coded and synced over. You'll notice that you have search and filter options up at the top as well. And so these are really helpful. At Ramp, we like to give our customers all the information that they need and then give them the tools so that they can refine what they're looking at, however it makes sense for their use case. So you can apply filters, and if you only wanted to look at transactions within a certain department or location, you can apply those filters here. You can look at specific date ranges, specific dollar amounts, the submission policy status. So if you only want to sync over transactions where the policy is complete, You can apply this filter to ensure that you're not syncing over any transactions with missing or unavailable items. You can look into the transaction state, and this is a quick and easy way to see, okay, which transactions were out of policy. You can also look into the receipt status to see how the team is capturing receipts and see, are they taking advantage of the receipt capture integrations? And then lastly, we have the accounting status. We'll dive into this a little bit later on today's call, but the category field is required to sync. So at a high level, it's missing fields for sync. In this case, it's missing the required value for category. Next, we have can be marked as ready, which means the category has been filled out, but it has not yet been marked as ready to sync. And then lastly, we have ready to sync. So now when we're looking at all of the transactions on this page, you'll see that the transaction itself will show the merchant name up at the top. So in this case, we're seeing the Smith. And then below that, we're showing the Ramp category. We can see the transaction amount, the cardholder's name, their department and location, the QuickBooks category, and then if we scroll to the right, we can see any relevant receipts or memos, the vendor, etc. You can always click into the transaction itself, and we'll show even more information here. So you can see a little bit more information around the transaction review policy, the submission policy. You can look at the receipts and memos, and then this is actually one of the ways where you can actually view the transaction. So now if we wanted to code this transaction, so in this case, we might want to say, okay, the Smith, that should be meals and entertainment. You'll notice that I can manually type in the value, or I can scroll down for it and select. And now I've manually coded that transaction. So you can go through this list. In this case, we're looking at roughly 2,700 transactions. You can manually populate each one of these values to code them. So that would be pretty time consuming, especially with the amount of transactions that we have. So at Ramp, what we like to recommend is if we look at the transaction below, so you'll notice that the merchant name is different, but the Ramp category is the same. So we have up above, the Smith is the merchant, and then below we have Grubhub merchant, but they're both falling into the same category. So now we can click this dropdown, and now let's press Create Rules at the bottom. So you'll notice that when I go to create a rule, there are 3 different types of rules that I can create. When we think about Ramp rules, I like to think of them like a hierarchy. I honestly like to think of it as a pyramid. So if we're thinking about a standard pyramid, think of category rules at the bottom. The reason being they are the most broad set of rules. The criteria that needs to be met in order for that rule to apply is the most broad. It's looking at a variety of different merchants that are all falling into one category. So in this case, you'll notice that if we were to set a rule for the Ramp category of restaurants, this would apply to 514 unsynced transactions. So the beauty of setting up rules within Ramp is that you only need to set up the rule once, and it will apply to all unsynced transactions as well as any transactions moving forward that match the criteria for that rule. So in this case, if I were to set up a category rule for restaurants, I've already saved myself having to go through and manually code 500 plus different transactions with just one click. So we'll say anytime the Ramp category is restaurants, the QuickBooks category should be meals and entertainment. So now I'll press Create Rule. And we'll start to see that reflected below. You'll notice that anytime you populate the category via a rule, you can always tell because there's a lightning bolt icon. And if you hover over that lightning bolt icon, it'll actually show you which rule applied to this category value. So in this case, it's showing, hey, if you want to edit this, you can edit the Ramp category and map it back to a different QuickBooks category. One thing that's important to note with rules is I like to think of them as a starting point. It's a great way to just get values there, but you still have the ability to manually override. So I can still say, actually, Jeff only uses Grubhub when traveling, so maybe this is travel meals. you'll notice that I can still manually override that rule. So next let's look at another rule, and let's do Uber Eats. So Uber Eats is a good example because the merchant is Uber Eats and it's pulling from Uber. But in this case, the category is taxi and rideshare. And when I think of Uber Eats and how I use it, I'm certainly not using it to get around. So what we might want to do here is we might want to say, okay, let's set up a merchant rule. So now we can say select rules again. Now we'll say anytime the merchant is Uber Eats, the team only uses this when traveling. So we'll say, okay, these are all of our travel meals. And again, we'll press create rule and we'll see those values populated. So there are two different types of rules that you can create. I would say on the broader level, we just created a category rule first, then we moved into a merchant rule. So if we look at another example, let's do Starbucks, for example. So let's create a rule for Starbucks and say, okay, this is a travel meal. When we're looking at this transaction, you'll notice that we're now setting a rule on the merchant level, but travel meals is a different value than restaurants. So we just set up a category rule for restaurants and said anytime the category is restaurants, we want the QuickBooks category to be meals and entertainment. And now we're saying, okay, anytime the category is Starbucks, we want it to be travel meals. And so these two rules are actually conflicting because they're pointing back to different values. So this is where the hierarchy of rules comes in. So in order for a merchant rule to be met, it's much more specific criteria than a category rule. It's saying, category rules are a variety of different merchants all fitting into one category, whereas a merchant rule is just looking at one specific merchant. So anytime there's a conflict between a merchant rule and a category rule, the category rule will be overridden by the merchant rule. So if we set this up and say, okay, Starbucks, always pointing back to travel meals, you'll notice that the merchant rule overrode the category rule. And that's because the criteria that needed to be met in order for this rule to apply was more specific, so it'll override that rule. I typically get a couple of questions around this part, so I'll go ahead and take a quick pause before we move forward. If you feel good to go on category and merchant rules and are ready to move forward, feel free to give me a thumbs up emoji. And if you have any questions, as always, feel free to drop those into the chat as well. Okay, I've seen a good amount of thumbs up. So now we'll move on to the last set of rules. I would say this is probably my favorite set of rules just because it's so applicable. And we'll actually start by applying a filter. And so let's apply a filter and only look at a specific card merchant. So we're actually going to look at LinkedIn in this case. Whoops. When we're looking at transactions from LinkedIn, you'll notice that we have a variety of different cardholders who have transactions with LinkedIn. LinkedIn is a great example of the last set of rules, which is card rules. And so even at Ramp internally, we use LinkedIn three different ways. So our marketing team uses LinkedIn Ads, our sales team uses LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and our recruiting team uses LinkedIn Recruiter. And so when we think about those three different use cases, LinkedIn is by no means an inexpensive product. And so those are three fairly high areas of spend for us. But when we're thinking about, okay, how do we code these transactions? The merchant is always LinkedIn. The category is always going to be SaaS and software. And so there's no great way at scale, I should say, to see, okay, what makes up our ad spend, what makes up our LinkedIn Recruiter spend, and what makes up our Sales Navigator spend. And that's where card rules really come into play, and I would say really shine. So what you can do is you can apply rules on the card level. And so if you were on yesterday or last week's platform overview, You may remember that I stressed an importance on setting up vendor-specific virtual cards. So in this case, we actually have 3 different LinkedIn cards internally. Our head of marketing has one for LinkedIn ads, our head of sales has one for LinkedIn Sales Navigator, and our head of recruiting has one for LinkedIn Recruiter. We've applied rules on the card level so that we're able to differentiate all of our different areas of spend within LinkedIn at scale. So you can set up a card rule by first clicking into the dropdown and then clicking Create Rules. And you'll notice that all the way at the bottom, you can select the card name. So this is why I also find it really helpful, to set the vendor name or the purpose of the card as the card name, because when you're setting up card rules in the accounting page, it's actually going to pull the card name in here. So it's saying anytime we have a transaction on this card, we want the category to be this. So now let's say this is our ad spend. So we can select advertising and press create rule. One thing that I would call out is if you are setting up rules on the card level, please just go in and add either merchant controls so that the vendor is the only accepted merchant or category controls. That way you don't have to worry about miscellaneous transactions being coded incorrectly if, for whatever reason. So you'll notice that on card rules, given the criteria is so specific, it's saying only transactions on this specific card, you have the ability to auto mark transactions as ready. We'll leave this off for now, but we can see the category is populated and now we can select add rules. You'll notice that anytime a category is populated via a card rule, it will be reflected by that card icon. What's helpful here is that you'll notice as I scroll down, I'm not seeing the other cardholders' values populated because it's only applying to Megan's specific card. So Megan's other transactions are still populated with, advertising, but this is a way for us to differentiate our spend when we have a few different use cases with the same merchant. Next, if we look at Andrew, maybe Andrew does, let's say that he's in charge of LinkedIn Recruiter. So we'll put this as job expenses. Now we can press create rule, go through the same process and click add rules. And we'll now see that populated below. So now we've differentiated what our spend looks like with the same merchant at scale. So scrolling down, we can see advertising job expenses populated below. And then lastly, let's say Peter is head of sales. And so we might want to code this as dues and subscriptions. We'll select the card rule, and now we'll press create rule. We'll press add rules, and we'll see that reflected below. So when we scroll down, we can start to see, okay, these values are populated. We were able to populate these values even though the merchant is always the same as well as the category. So what I like to recommend customers do, especially when setting up rules, I get it, it can be scary at first. What I recommend doing is I would recommend clicking into where it has accounting rules up at the top. You'll notice that you can set up rules on the category level here or on the merchant level very easily. So if I click into category, you'll notice that it's showing me all of the categories I've recently used. So you can just start going through here and saying, okay, advertising goes back to advertising, airlines, travel, alcohol and bars, maybe we'll do meals and entertainment, etc. You can go through and start populating these. Like I mentioned, if you ever want to manually override the category that was filled in via a rule, you can always manually override that. So it's not like rules are the end all be all. Anytime you manually override something, that will always be the end all be all. So you do still have some constraints, but this at least gives you a starting point. So it helps, at least get off the ground running. You don't have to at least now go through and manually populate each and every value. So it's a really big time saver. So now when we're looking, we'll click out of that filter. Now when we're looking at our transactions, let's look at this column on the right. So we have a column that says sync. You'll notice that I can click this Mark Ready button for any transactions where the category is populated. But if we look two below that, the category is not populated. And if I try to click this, even if I try to press down, I am not able to mark this as ready. So you don't ever have to worry about accidentally syncing over uncoded transactions from Ramp. We will only provide the ability to sync over coded transactions. So while you can go through and individually mark every single one of these as ready, at Ramp, we are passionate about not making our customers do the same repetitive work day in and day out or over and over again. So what I would recommend doing is I would recommend just clicking the Select All button. You'll notice that the default page view is 50 transactions. So in this case, we've already marked 2 as ready, so only 48 were selected. But of those 48, I can only mark 21 of these as ready. The remaining 27 transactions do not yet have the category filled out. So even if I go to select all of these, I can only actually select those with the category filled out. Now I can press Mark as ready, and you'll notice that anytime you mark a transaction as ready, you'll see how many transactions have been marked as ready reflected in this sync button. So it'll show the exact number of transactions that you've marked as ready. If we go back to select all of these, you'll notice that you also have the option to select across every single page. So now we can say, okay, let's select across all of the different pages, but I can still only mark around 780 transactions as ready. So once you've marked those as ready, you can click Sync, and it's going to bring you to a window that looks like this. So you'll have one additional opportunity to review all of your transactions and review the categories. So we'll do a quick spot check here. We might want to check out this one and say, why was this dues and subscriptions? Right below that, we might want to see, why was this job expenses? And this is a good example of if you're setting up rules on the card level, having card controls in place. For example, if we look at this transaction, I don't know about you all, but my Peloton certainly is not a job expense for me. And so we might want to take a look at this. So that's why card controls are just important, especially when setting up rules on the card level, just to ensure that you don't run into anything like this. So once you go through and give a quick scan and make sure that all transactions look good to go, you can now press sync. So if you are using a universal CSV option, you will see a button to export. But if you are using an integrated ERP, in this case, I'm using QuickBooks, but I know we have some Sage and Xero users on the line. You can just press Sync to QuickBooks. Up at the top, you will be able to see your sync progress. And like I mentioned earlier, the accounting page is only going to show your unsynced transactions. So as you sync those transactions over from Ramp into your team's ERP, those will disappear from the accounting page. You can always access those via the Transactions tab, and so you will still be able to find those in Ramp, but for the purpose of the accounting page, it's only going to show your unsynced transactions. So with that being said, let's say out of all of these transactions I just synced, I realized, okay, I might want to go in and change one value. If I wanted to do that, I would need to do so in QuickBooks. So once you've synced a transaction from Ramp into your ERP, any changes that you want to make will need to be done in your team's ERP. The reason being, we don't want to risk, having duplicates in your team's ERP by resyncing and whatnot. And so that's why you will need to make any and all adjustments in your team's ERP after syncing. So then the last thing I'll go through today is just going to be the sync history. So if we click into sync history, we can see when the last sync occurred, who performed the last sync. We're actually looking at the one still in progress. So if it's still in progress, we'll show the most recent number of transactions synced. So if you are looking at this, I would just recommend waiting until after the sync happens. Really only takes a couple of minutes. But you can always click into this and see, okay, how many? And you can always download the CSV as well if you'd like.